Welcome back to part 2 on CrossFit competition simulations. And this one I'm going to be going through a specific example, running through a simulation that I did with two of the athletes that I coach. And because we were all gearing up for competitions, in-person competitions in January specifically. So I'm going to explain why we did it this way, why we structured it, my thought process behind it, and just walk through the events and like what the structure of them looked like. And again, this is going to be a great follow-up to the previous podcast, episode number 126, which I would encourage you to go listen to if you haven't already. So really quickly, I want to review part 1. First thing I sought to do was answer 3 questions. Number 1 is, who is the simulation best for and who is it inappropriate for? It is best for an athlete who will benefit more from doing a simulation and practicing the rhythms and the patterns that are necessary to be at their best there and gaining confidence from going through that process than it is for them to go about their normal training. And likewise, who is it inappropriate for? It's an athlete who they should just spend more time in their normal training because it's going to put them into a recovery deficit, or they're not going to make up in terms of like specific weaknesses they have relative to the field if they go through that that competition simulation any more than if they would just go about their normal training, right? If that's the situation, then probably it doesn't necessarily make sense to go through a mock simulation. Okay. 2, what is the best timing for a simulation? Basically, maybe 3 to 6 weeks out from competition, enough time where it clears up fatigue, but not so long that the athlete doesn't feel like the competition is like imminent, that it's like right there and like in front of them and like they want to actually give full effort. So balancing, make sure that they can be recovered with making sure that they're actually feeling ready and sharp to do a simulation. And then 3, what should a simulation entail and what should it not entail? Basically, just as it sounds, you're simulating the competition. You're trying to get as close as you can to replicating what you're actually going to be doing. However, you're not trying to put your bias onto it. You're trying to put the competition organizer's bias onto it. And the only way you can do that is if you go through the 5 steps that I laid out, which is how you actually program a CrossFit simulation. 1 is to research your competition. Gather all the past events, all the past venues, as much data as you can about the specifics of what actually happened, and just sort of get a general sense of what's going on. 2 is to perform an analysis on that. So looking at durations of workouts, the common movement pairings, the typical time caps, any unique movements or venues that they have. Just again, getting as many details and a more clear picture through an analysis to help kind of augment the understanding that you already have of what's going on at the competition. 3 is to do a cross comparison. And again, specifically here, looking at relative to a typical CrossFit testing body, how is this different, right? Are we seeing more of a certain movement? Are we seeing more of a certain time domain? Are we seeing unique elements that are being repeated every single year because it's sort of unique to that competition and sort of that puts their signature stamp onto it, so to speak? How does it compare to, again, a typical CrossFit competition? 4, as you're actually beginning to program the simulation itself, thinking about biasing programming to existing events, ones that are already out there, making formats that are similar to that. We're just using past workouts to create your simulation. And then 5, less is more. The goal is not to beat down your athletes. The goal is not to have them feel like they actually went through a real competition where they are just completely trash afterwards, potentially, or maybe there's just like way too many events. You need to just understand that, like, okay, the goal is for them to feel prepared, to have a confidence boost, but not to have lingering fatigue, and certainly not to be dealing with nagging injuries or real injuries that pop up as a result of doing that simulation. So less is more. The fitness movement is brought to you by Zor Fitness. We offer coaching and individualized program design, as well as educational content for coaches and athletes. It's all at one place, zorfitness.com. One more thing that I want to talk through before I actually go through those 5 steps for the simulation that we did was why the simulation and why now? Why the timing of it? So firstly, the timing of it. Again, one of the principles that we go back to is like just trying to avoid disrupting regular training as much as possible. All right, so allowing the athletes to continue to string good training weeks back to back, continue to string good training cycles back to back, that's like the primary goal of like almost all training, right? It's just continue to have them stack wins. So a simulation is not trying to detract from that at all. However, it can be sort of almost a break in some respects from normal training. So specifically for the athletes who did this, myself, it was Riley Stoltzfus and Sam Hagen, who all three of us did this. We're in a very similar boat where we're all competing in January. Riley's going to be doing Wodapalooza on a team, which is a little bit different, but I'll get into specifics of why we all did the same one. Sam and I are competing at TFX, the Fittest Experience, so Texas, and 1 week after Riley, I believe. So yeah, why that timing? Again, we're all going to be doing camp here, me to a lesser degree, however, it's still an output for me. And then for Sam and Riley, who are actually going to be participating in it, it's a packed weekend, even for people who are volume adapted and resilient like they both are. It's still a disruption of like normal training for them. So it's just something that we need to be aware of. I was trying to avoid being really close to that, right? I didn't really want to be within 2 weeks of doing that. So basically that's what sort of made sense here. Is like, okay, we're deloading after sort of our first comp prep. We'll then go into the simulation. We'll go through another short training phase, camp, and then basically maybe a few more days of realistically of training, and then a taper to actually prep for the competition. So that's why the timing of things just made sense, where it's basically maximizing their normal training time, and then putting, in this case, it was like camp's already set in stone. So the simulation at a time where it makes sense that they're going to be able to put a good effort out onto it. And yet again, it still feels like, oh yeah, this is it. We actually are approaching competition, and I'm excited to like gear up and do this thing. So those are all sort of like the reasons like why the timing was the way it was. And then people are probably wondering like, why is Riley doing this if she's competing in Wodapalooza? This is really a TFX simulation. It's because she did TFX the prior year, and she did all of these exact same workouts along with me. I didn't go to TFX. I just did them along with her to help her out. Wasn't coaching her at the time, but yeah, I mean, for her, it's going to be a huge confidence boost, because she's likely going to see in every single test that she's going to improve dramatically, just because she's way fitter than she was last year. So that's going to be cool to see. And like the goal is really for it to be a confidence boost for her, right? And then for me and Sam, we're obviously preparing for the Fittest Experience, so that makes perfect sense. And the statistical analysis really didn't change from 2023 to 2024. It really just kind of was in alignment with what was already there, so it doesn't really make sense to change that. And Sam hasn't done this simulation yet, so it makes sense for him to do it. And then for me, it's like, would I do a different set of tests just because I've already done these and I don't want to retest them? For me personally, I think there's more benefits from me basically getting the push, because I'm doing this with other athletes and knowing that I'm going to be comparing my data versus theirs and seeing where things are stacked up at. And then also just like the camaraderie of like doing it together. I will push way harder doing that than if I just did some other simulation on my own, just made up new workouts for me to do just for kicks and gigs. So basically that was my thought process as to why, each of us, it makes sense for us to do it, even if it wasn't maybe a perfect fit for the event or the athlete based on timing. For me, as I think about this, it's like, you want to, as a coach or as an athlete, like leverage, pockets of your community to basically to elevate each other's performance level, right? That should really be the goal of something along these lines, is to build confidence and just like let the tide raise all the ships. So let's actually go through programming this event. 1 was doing the research, 2 was performing the analysis and the cross comparison, and then 3 is actually programming it and keeping in mind some of the principles that I mentioned. So researching your competition and doing the analysis, I had already done this before for Riley the previous year. So the good thing about this sort of thing is like you can just sort of add to it as you go about it. I have the same thing for all the CrossFit games and quarterfinals and semifinals and age groupers and all the spreadsheets in all the world. Basically I have all of the events written out, and then like looking at like different movement selections, time domains, that sort of thing, right? I have that for basically every major competition that I've had an athlete do, right? So I have it for like Fittest on the Coast, Wodapalooza. I have it for obviously TFX and the game season and masters and teens and the whole deal. So, moving on. So I have all the events written out here. I have some general notes about it and like what movements came up. And then one of the big things that I did was I created a movement checklist. So I just went through each event, checking them off. It's kind of monotonous, but it is what it is. For example, the first workout from last year was overhead squats was the strength. It's like, okay, 1x on overhead squat. That was one appearance of it. And then I go to event 2 and it's like, okay, that one has hang squat cleans and ring muscle ups. Okay, so those each get a mark. And then it's double unders and handstand walks. I'm Xing off each of those. And then slowly over time, you'll get a list of all the movements and then also the number of appearances that they have. So for TFX, one of the things that was very clear, I didn't even do this for 5 years, but there was 5 appearances of vested workouts, which again is very important to note because there's at least one vested workout every single year. 4 appearances of running. So again, at least one a year. Double unders as well. So 2 appearances, like high appearances of bounding movements, which is important to know. And then handstand walk. And again, some of these things you can start to correlate back to like other aspects of the venue. So for example, like you're probably not going to be taking stuff out of a rack just because like the rig that's brought in probably doesn't have J-cups on it. They bring in the stall mats where like the rubber flooring, and it's often uneven or it doesn't even cover the entire floor because they have like dirt at some spots. So again, practically speaking, you're probably more likely to see like handstand walking than like handstand push-ups, because in fact, handstand push-ups have never shown up. Again, if you have a rig set up, you might not have a wall ball target on it. Funny enough, wall balls have never shown up. You may or may not get like dumbbell variations, right? In fact, there's been very little of that. So like that's the sort of thing you could pay attention to. Legless rope climbs, they do have that. Again, for like me in the elite division, I'm very likely to see the legless version of that because they probably want to have multiple tiers of different workouts where they can sort of compare against, the RX division versus the elite division, for example. So again, likely for me, I'm much more likely to see a legless rope climb versus probably just a regular rope climb at this point. I think a lot of that sort of thing you can just sort of like intuitively understand, right? If you're going to have a pull-up bar and rings set up, you're probably going to do ring muscle-ups, and you're probably going to do something like a toes to bar variation, right? Versus like saying, okay, we're going to do chest to bar and we're going to do bar muscle-ups. Not that hasn't happened, because it has. However, you're more likely to see them trying to use their equipment in as many unique ways as they can. So legless rope climbs and ring muscle-ups have had 3 appearances. Snatches has a 3, shoulder overhead of 3, sandbags I've had 3, or a D-ball, I forget which it was. But again, that's the sort of thing that you just need to pay attention to. And a lot of their max strength events, there's like pulling off the floor, right? Even if it's an overhead squat or something, you're not taking it out of a rack. So if you're overhead squatting from the floor, it's like a power clean back rack, widen out the hands into an overhead squat. There's a lot different process that you just go through for that. And then after I went through that analysis, there's a lot of notes that I went and just sort of like checked off, and like kind of stuff that as I continued to go through, I sort of had like kept notes in the background. And some of these were implications of those things. One was getting comfortable with this, a sandbag and a weight vest. 2 things that have shown up that are unique that, again, a lot of athletes have had some exposures to, but not like something that they're doing all the time in their regular training. So making sure that you're getting touches of that. Lifting without a rack and minimal dropping. So there's a lot more from the hang. Minimal dropping just meaning that like from the organizer's standpoint, it seems like they didn't have as much pulling from the floor, just because like the floor is probably uneven. This is my interpretation of it, maybe, is that, yeah, they did more from the hang just so people weren't going back down to the uneven stall mats as often. Likely to get like some sort of a strength event that's not out of a rack. So even if it is a squatting event, you still got to get it up to your shoulders or up to the overhead position. You're likely to see handstand walking, muscle ups, legless rope climbs, double unders, and some sort of a lifting ladder. Those are all things that had a lot of appearances. They will want to use the venue. Duh. In this case, it was like, okay, they have a pull-up bar, they have a rope, they have rings, they have running. All things. And they also have used it like a parking lot with like a torque tank and D-ball before. So again, just important things to note of in like terms of like how they structure the events, thoughts about it. There's typically 6 events over 3 days of competition, and that's not a lot of volume for high-level athletes. So it's more about intensity and the lead up to this as you're preparing the athletes versus just trying to beat them down because it's a 12-event competition like the games or something. 7, they usually buy at least 1 set of ergs and then resell them after the event. So basically what that means is almost fair game is what ergs pop up or what implements like a torque tank or a sandbag or something, because they'll just sell it. Right? Like they will buy it and then they'll sell it at the competition and they'll just have a turnover for the next year. Like they have a fleet of rowers or a fleet of skiers, and then they'll just sell them. So in other words, it's probably not a bad idea to continue to exposures on all the ergs. Weight vests have shown up in at least one workout every year, and often when that actually appears, it's usually in either a bounding or a grip limited workout. So it's either like hanging gymnastics or like running or double unders in that workout. 9, the RX category moved to mirror the Pro division in 2022. I called it Elite before, they call it Pro. Likely stay that way moving forward. So in other words, as the event organizers, you're probably going to write the workouts where even the bottom part of the RX division is able to complete them. Maybe not like, under a time cap or something, but they're able to actually do the movements. So in other words, it maybe isn't as crazy of a move selection for the Pro division. And then running and double unders and likely box jumps will be tested in some capacity. There's usually at least one bounding movement that's coming up. And then finally, number 11, complexes and ladders on a very tight clock. Usually this was like an EMOM ladder where, again, rest is going to be very short, or like you have like 5 minutes to like establish a max lift. They're trying to get a lot of heats through and not a long time. So it's just like important that the athlete can be confident under a really high pressure environment for lifting. Do you have a topic that you'd like to request as a future show, or just a question about training? Reach out to me. My email is ben@zorfitness.com, or you can DM me on Instagram @zorfitness. Lastly, head over to zorfitness.com if you want to browse all of our previous shows with in-depth show notes, as well as educational content for all things training. So those were the first 2 steps: research and competition, performing an analysis. And then next would be like doing a cross comparison. And for me, this isn't really difficult because I'm pretty used to what we're seeing as like a quarterfinals testing body so far, and like what we're preparing, like Sam and Riley and even myself for in terms of like the regular CrossFit game season. And one of the big things is like, okay, you're not going to get like outdoor running in like a quarterfinals. So you might get shuttle runs, you might get double unders, might get box jumps, but you're not likely to see like a long event that's like 30 plus minute with like a mass start. You're not going to see that, which you could very well see that at a Wodapalooza or TFX. And you're not going to get like linear running. It could also be like outdoors, up and down. It could be vested, right? So the vested thing is another big difference for TFX. And then the swimming thing is a huge difference for Wodapalooza. Like those are things that you're just not going to see. Likewise, you're pretty unlikely to see like a heavy double under or drag rope in a quarterfinals testing body. However, Wodapalooza and TFX have both implemented like heavy ropes, for example, or like a torque tank, or like a ski erg, or a bike erg, or even an air bike, because like those are things that, like, besides the rower, because it's easiest to be standardized, you're not seeing other ergs in online competition environments, and making sure that you're getting just touches of those other things. Like those sorts of things are what we're talking about. Or maybe like a high foam box where you're going to have like a series of those. Like you might have 10 of those because you got 10 lanes at the competition, where that's very easy to bring in that sort of thing at an in-person competition, but it's very difficult to standardize that sort of thing at an online competition. Most difference here in terms of like Wodapalooza TFX versus like a quarterfinals testing body was just the fact that like quarterfinals is a online competition. And with a qualifier, there's always difficult things about like, standardizing and making sure that everything's uniform, and like floor layouts, right? As simple as like advancing equipment to like illustrate, the workout for like the fans is something that's probably way more likely to be seen at you don't see that at a quarterfinals test. And you're going to obviously see that if it's a quality competition at an in-person event. So yeah, things like that. So I didn't really need an in-depth cross comparison, but that was sort of like my thought process. Then actually getting into the programming itself. So let's actually go to the simulation and walk through it. I will link to this in the show notes and the description on YouTube. Event number 1 was actually a 2-parter. Event 1A and 1B, Road to Glory, 12-minute clock. Event 1A was a 1-mile run in a weight vest, and event 1B was an AMRAP in the remaining time of that 10-minute clock, of 4 alternating pistols and 4 box jump overs to typical heights. And again, both parts were in a weight vest. Event 2, hinge pull, which was a variation off squat pull, which was one of their workouts. So very, very similar structure of workouts. So it's basically changed from squatting reps to hinging reps, as the name alludes to. 4 time with a 14-minute cap, 15 bar muscle ups, 45 deadlifts, 155, 105, 30 chest to bar, 30 cleans, 155, 105, 45 pull-ups, 15 snatches, 155, 105. And there you're advancing the barbell 12 feet for each new movement. So that was day number 1. Day 2, event 3, grip and RIP, RIP, 4 2-minute intervals with 60 seconds of rest between each of those intervals. 60 double unders, 3 legless rope climbs to 12 feet, and then dual kettlebell clean and jerks from the hang, 53 for males per hand, 35 for ladies. Advance the kettlebells after every 5 reps, and I believe that was 6 feet that we advanced the kettlebells there. Again, 60 seconds between rounds. So you're continuing to go in that fashion until you reach 50 reps or until the end of that 4th 2-minute interval. Event 4, max complex. 5-minute clock, 4 max load, 3 cleans, and 1 jerk. And then day 3, event 5, rump pump. 4 time with a 16-minute cap, 3 sandbag clean, 3 sandbag squats, 60-foot sandbag carry, 30-foot handstand walk, and then it climbs with the same movements. 6 sandbag clean, 6 sandbag squat, 60-foot carry, 30-foot handstand walk, 9 clean, 9 squat, 60-foot carry, 30-foot handstand walk, and 12 sandbag clean, 12 sandbag squat, 60-foot carry, 30-foot handstand walk. 150-pound bag for males, 100 for females. And then finally was the finale, with 4 time with a 5-minute cap, 40 calories for males, 30 for females on an air bike, 20 burpee box get-overs to 40 inches for males and females, and you may use your hands to get over the box, and then 10 meters of an overhead walking lunge, 185 for males, 125 for females. So those are the events. I definitely didn't entirely make them all up. One was that Road to Glory one, the 2-parter was with the 1 mile run, and the pistols and box jump overs was one that they had already done. And then I made a small iteration off the squat pull workout to being a hinge pull workout, just because there was already some squat volume and bounding stuff with the pistols before. I didn't want people's knees getting really irritated from this, so I just made it a hinging based thing. And that's one thing that I kind of like rely on as I write these, is like only deviate from it as it like makes sense, right? You want basically the totality of the simulation to make sense. So if you need to make adjustments to the individual events or the program as a whole to make sure that, again, it just like follows good program design principles of like just programming any other competition, that's probably a good idea, provided that it still reflects the competition, which it obviously did. So that's what I mean by biasing towards like existing events. Like some of them were iterations of workouts we had already seen, exact variations of workouts we had already seen, or very similar structuring of events, like a 5-minute clock for a clean complex of some kind, or intervals with 60 seconds of rest where you reset in between and there's like a buy in each round, and like advancing your piece of work, your implement, that is. Or like a sandbag, handstand walk, like strongman gymnastics combination is very common. Or like a finale where it's more like gritty and like a short sprint chipper sort of thing. Again, all things that you would be very likely to see in a competition like this. Finally, I would kind of underscore one more time that less is more. For Riley, Sam, and myself, this was a significant reduction in the training that we would normally do on 3 normal training days. So in terms of the total work that we're doing, not necessarily just like prep time for it, because you can, obviously, if you're at a competition, you can spend way more time than you would normally do to prep for each workout to make sure you're as primed as you need to be, as like perfect like cooldowns. There's a lot more, like, again, as I said before in the previous one, like game day hygiene around that, which does take some time. Certainly fueling and all that stuff takes time. Cameras, if you're gonna like film it and like review and like that sort of stuff, all takes time. So it's still the stress, but in terms of like training volume, it was a pretty significant reduction, again, compared to what we're just normally doing on like a day-to-day normal basis. One more thing to sort of underscore is that there's going to be plenty of stress when you're actually doing this if you do it correctly and do it well. However, it shouldn't be so draining that it detracts from your normal good quality training moving forward. And then like the results, like how I felt about it, my reflections, I think it definitely appropriately challenged each of the athletes, like each of the three of us who did it. And it was a good comparison for myself and from Riley from the previous year. It was far enough away where like I didn't even really remember a lot of the events of like the specifics around them or like how they felt necessarily. For Riley, she's just like a dramatically different athlete than she was last year at this time, which is obviously really cool to see. But overall, they haven't released any of the workouts yet for any of her competitions, but I'm expecting that is going to, at least in some way, have carryover and benefit to the athletes, if nothing else, from a confidence building perspective. Like, I feel like we are prepared to actually go and hit our competition and do it well. And there's also a few things that kind of popped up as a result of this simulation that are sort of like, not like red flags, but there's sort of like things to kind of call attention to and like, okay, we should continue to touch on this thing because there's an avenue here that we probably have additional low-hanging fruit, an area that we can leverage. Just like things that we continue to work on. It's like learnings that happened with the individual athletes that will only benefit them as we go into our final training block leading into the competitions. So that's how I actually go about the process of programming a CrossFit simulation. Thanks for listening today. If you're someone who just started listening to the show, I would encourage you to subscribe so you can stay up to date. If you're someone who's been listening for a while, I would encourage you to rate and review the show. And lastly, the best thing that you can do to support our work is also the best thing that you can do for your performance. And that is by hiring one of our coaches. Until next time, stay the course.